Kia ora. Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, I also wish to begin by thanking the Minister for the opportunity of a 17-hour debate to show the superb alternatives which are available to the failed government policies which the other side have failed really to turn up and defend tonight. Now, Mr Speaker, each of the three opposition parties have been able to demonstrate the quality of their various proposals in the alternative to the government's policies. And I have a lot of respect for each and every one of the parties' proposals, and I hope the government has, rather the public, has now understood that there really are alternatives to housing failure and the national government. I want to thank the Labor Party for its excellent suggestions, most of which New Zealand First supported. I want to thank the Greens for doing the same. I want to thank the Maori Party for changing its mind. I want to thank them for changing their mind after supporting urgency and then voting against the government by voting for all of the opposition parties' amendments. Now, it seems a little bit strange, but I think they deserve some congratulation for a willingness to change their mind in that way. But I'm not, because I am a little bit disappointed because they didn't actually show up to debate. Not once. 17 hours, not a word. Now, that is a bit of a disappointment. Is it because they're simply not keeping up with the situation? Or surely it can't be they don't really care about policies such as offer back and the impact it would have on the people they claim to represent. But I'm not going to spend too much time on that because it really doesn't matter. What I do want to say, Mr Speaker, is this about the Minister for Homelessness, because he didn't mention in his last speech the fact that today, this week, Auckland house prices for an ordinary two-bedroom house has now reached the magic but tragic $1 million. Most New Zealanders are still in disbelief over that, and you can understand why. That, if anything, is absolute evidence of the failure of government policy right there. Now, the Minister also didn't mention the failure of the state housing areas which are the subject of this bill. And he didn't mention special, what did I say? No, I meant special housing areas. And in fact, the truth is that over the last 3 years, only 1,300 houses have been built as a result of that policy. And the need, as I've previously said in my speeches, is actually something like 20,000 houses per year over the next 7 years in Auckland alone. And yet, this is the pathetic result we get from this government. That also is evidence of total failure of government policy. But what the Minister did say, Mr Speaker, what he did say showed a total lack of empathy for people who can't afford that $1 million for an ordinary home and who can't afford the rent increases which are now skyrocketing out of reach of most people. And a lot of them have to move continually, chasing lower and lower rentals so that they can just find a place to live. And I think it's simply because the National Party really doesn't care. It actually doesn't care about that. And what it does care is that its supporters will be happy about the increase in value of their homes. What it does care about is that the private developers who no doubt give donations to the National Party will be able to make greater profits, but it doesn't really care about the people who are affected. Now, Mr Speaker, this bill is mostly about extending the SHAs another 3 years. So we're entitled to say, will that work? So in that context, let's have a look, first of all, at what the Minister has said just this week. Firstly, he said, and I quote, "Auckland house prices are out of control," unquote. And that's the only thing this week he's been right about, the only thing. And he also said, and I quote this week, quote, "I won't rest until that house price inflation rate gets down to single figures, unquote. Now, let's just think about that. With average house prices in Auckland now $1 million and single-figure inflation, well, that would still mean another $100,000 at least per year on the price of a home. And more than that, worse than that, an extra $20,000 to be found for a deposit. Now, that actually shows how out of touch the minister actually is about this. And I want to also quote Shamabeel Yaku, who said this. He said, and I quote, "Based on my calculations, the typical Auckland house would take 71 years to buy, 20 years of savings for a deposit, and 51 years of repayments to clear the debt." So you'd actually have to live 71 years just to get rid of, well, actually you'd have to live longer than that, because you wouldn't be able to start getting a loan until you were about 20. So there you go, 91 years before you'd have a mortgage-free home. But it's worse than that, Mr. Speaker. It's worse than that, because what this actually does say, and what the message is to first home seekers, is this: the Kiwi dream of getting your own house is now just the dream of getting a house deposit, nothing more, or renting for the rest of your life. Now, Nick Smith wants to bring house prices back to 4 times household incomes without reducing house prices, and household incomes would therefore need to increase to at least $250,000 per year in order to do that. Now, how many people are going to fall into that category? Well, we know that most people by far will get nowhere near that kind of income. So, in answer to my question, will it work? The only reasonable conclusion is that the government's housing policy is an abject failure. The SHAs will have absolutely no hope of delivering the outcome which is claimed for them. And the reason for that is the government refuses to actually invest directly as well as doing these SHAs, and actually thinks that just relying on private investment will be enough. Well, it never will be. Without direct government investment, it never will be. Now, Mr. Speaker, finally, all this is exacerbated by other things. And the truth is that with open-door immigration and a net 70,000 people a year coming into New Zealand, especially to Auckland, there is no hope that any government policy, however bad or good it may be, will be able to succeed. New Zealand First is the only party which has constantly said that without controlling immigration, a solution to the housing crisis will never be found. It's not the only thing that needs to be done, but that also needs to be done, and we're the only party that's been saying it and will continue to do so. In addition, the situation is exacerbated by the failure of the government to provide any controls on overseas buyers. And again, New Zealand First has been pushing for that for years. Other parties have caught up a bit with us, but New Zealand First is the party that's been pushing that for years, and the truth is that those buyers have the cash to outbid Kiwis for homes in Auckland especially, and they have the intent to engage in capital gains farming, speculation and land banking, and all of those things are causes of the housing crisis which this government simply will not address. This government has been sitting on its hands and fiddling with failed policies while other parties have been coming up with genuine and effective alternatives which this government refuses to consider. They blame local government. They do nothing to stop land banking. They don't care about first home seekers. They ride roughshod over people's offer-back rights. They are an utterly hopeless failure, and Mr. Speaker, the sooner they go, the better.
Mr. Speaker.